The Xantho was a complete surprise in every single respect. Firstly, when we looked at it, everything was wrong with this shipwreck. There was a Royal Navy engine on it, a horizontal trunk engine. There didn't seem to be a condenser, so the ship was being using salt water for the boiler, we thought. There was a whole load of things that seemed totally wrong with this ship when we first saw it. Even more went wrong, or in our vision of whoever owned it, when we raised the engine and found that the engine was running backwards to drive the ship forwards. When we took it apart with Dick Garcia, John Carpenter and McLeod, we found nuts and bolts loose inside the cylinders. Everything said, who is the crazy man who would run this ship? The first steamer on the coast. And we looked at this and were led to Charles Broadhurst. Broadhurst had been completely dismissed as a failure, like his ship. And so we started to study it. So like in our world, the shipwreck is a focus down here, and it leads you into historical and corrosion and social studies. And in this case, we're going to social study of this man, Broadhurst. Spent 5 years at home studying him and in the library, and find that he basically introduced the hard hat to diving and failed. He was part of the group that taught the Aborigines how to dive. Not that they couldn't swim, but they didn't have to dive for pearling, and failed. He was one of the early pastoralists to try and land at Camden Harbour, formed a company called the Denison Plains Company, planning to walk, would you believe, from Camden Harbour to Halls Creek with a 6 months pregnant wife, 2 young kids under the age of 2, and her piano, and failed. Failed all the way. He basically fails in everything he does, including the Xantho, which sinks under him after 6 months. And it's trying to work out what's going on here. And when he does succeed, when he goes to Mandurah fish canning, he fails in that. And then he goes to guano mining, or bird fertiliser, on the Abrolhos Islands, enormous deposits of it, fails. And so, well, how can you have this? And we found that we had one of the greatest of the West Australian entrepreneurs. He was in court all the time. He was had up for misusing his labour. He was making something out of nothing. He had all sorts of vision, but he kept failing. And we found out, studying him very, very much over this time, that he only succeeded when he brought his son into the business, and his son was an accountant, had an accountancy training. Glorious example of how people with ideas have got to have the support crowd. And that is when he finally succeeds. But that's not enough for us. We said, well, okay, how did he keep rising from the ashes? Look at these failures. There's just list and list and list. But isn't this extraordinary? The guy actually is the forerunner to the giving of monopolies in the mining industry, the guano mining. And so he's the guy who's given the first monopoly. And he was considered by the government a man in 10,000, wonderful Mr. Broadhurst, but he kept into so much trouble. Even nominated to the upper house, but then had to resign because he mistreated his people. And so what's going on? And we get led to his wife. Now, Eliza Broadhurst is extraordinary. She marries him over in Victoria. He comes out from Manchester, follows his brother who's a squatter. They're on huge land at Kilmore. She is a singer, a musician, a teacher. She's extraordinarily well educated, and like most of those sorts of women, they go for good looking rogues, and they get married. They have 2 children over there, and he decides to come to Camden Harbour, and that fails, or Denison Plains. We look at her and find that every time he fails, she keeps the family afloat by opening up a day and boarding school, by teaching music, by teaching French and so on. And then we start to look at the diaries and find from the diaries, the Hillman diaries, for example, that all the young women are gravitating to Mrs. Broadhurst's place. Because at the end of the day, she came here with 2 children. She gave birth to the first white girl born in the Northwest. She went through famine, she went through shipwrecks and all sorts of things in that period. And so she was a very strong woman, also leading the culture. They're all coming to her. And we're learning about this, and we also are looking and learning about all the others in her family. But it's Eliza that we fix on initially, and Charles's brother, the one who becomes the guano merchant. But then we start to learn that when the guano merchant buys Charles out of the guano industry, and he pays his mum and dad £10,000, now that's not $20,000, it's £100 as a mid-level government servant annual wage. They go home to a place in Bournemouth that they call Karrakatta. And Karrakatta is a West Australian name, as you know, and they establish their home and they die there. There's a little girl in that picture that you see sitting on mum's knee with white dress and Blundstone boots, which is rather nice. She's in a christening dress with Blunny boots. Eliza's just lost a child. And we find that this little girl is following what we now know to be her mum's interest in feminism. We've got mum's scrapbook, and in it there's entries from Frau Minakar, who's the chief feminist in Europe at the time, questions about whether you should have double beds, questions about this and that and the other. She's reading the feminist literature, and this little girl we find is a suffragette. She throws hammers through the post office window. She's thrown into jail. She's force-fed. She comes back to WA, and she's part of a group called the St George Reading Circle, who were met by an American doctor, and she says to them, why don't you form a club? And the club is called the St George Reading Circle, but it changed its name to the Karrakatta Club. And it's that club that becomes the club that gets women the vote, in the third place in the world to get the vote. And there's no coincidence that the Karrakatta Club is named after their home, Karrakatta in England.